Well, hi, this is Suzanne Hannafin with Acumen Executive Search, and my lovely co-host, Tanis Morris, cannot be here today, but we're really excited to have Skip Newberry from the TAO, Technology Association of Oregon, to be part of our guest. And for those who are new to Hiring for Good is a podcast of best practices in leadership. And just to kind of do a little highlight of Skip's background, Skip earned his JD, was a startup founder of 2 companies before working with the city of Portland, and then in the last 12 years being with the TAO. And I know that's just a broad highlight, so I'm going to ask you, Skip, to fill in the gaps and share with us your journey.
Sure, thanks. So the one common theme in a relatively sort of convoluted and not quite linear career is I really enjoy learning about systems. And when I was in college, I liked learning about international relations and geopolitics, and that brought me to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a global think tank in DC, and I spent some time there as a fellow. That was fascinating work, and some of the work I was involved with involved a focus on sort of entrepreneurship and microfinance in the developing world, and also how to work with different diasporas of successful entrepreneurs in the U.S. from other countries, and how to kind of mobilize those groups to have political influence. And it was fascinating work, and I realized quickly that I didn't want to become just an academic, trading papers back and forth in terms of influencing international relations. And after talking to some sons and daughters of diplomats, I realized that if I wanted to have a family, maybe the diplomatic service was probably not for me because it wasn't terribly family friendly. Then ended up in deciding to pursue law, because I was like, okay, that's another system that I'd gotten exposed to in studying international trade, and was like, this is fascinating. And so decided that working in Boston during the dot-com boom, I had a chance to join a boutique law firm that was doing a lot of work with startups, venture capital, private equity, and we did a lot of work around financings, intellectual property, et cetera. And I was also involved in a startup on the side with some friends from college. And that was during the dot-com boom, 2000. And lo and behold, 2001 hits. There's the bubble bursts. And I got to see, working with, at the time, one of the few cyber bankruptcy attorneys in the US, everything that went wrong. And so it was a great experience in learning what problems to avoid. And I also realized how many startups get tripped up by a lack of understanding of the law or what intellectual property strategy looks like, et cetera. So I then went to law school with the idea that I was probably not going to practice terribly long, and ended up doing a couple clerkships in commercial litigation, and then got involved with a company in Boston that was starting to grow, and we came up with this idea for a company that was eventually spun out. And I ended up running it, and that was more in the professional development space, where we did kind of blended learning, both online and in person, on site, and that was really rewarding work. 3 years later, ended up transitioning off the content side of that business. Ended up doing some consulting with a couple other different startups, helping them get launched. And then I was in my late 20s in Portland at that time, and had been living here for about a few years, and really started to get a flavor for all the amazing people and companies and startups and talent that was here. And I was like, wow, this place is really gonna pop at some point. Just need some dots connected. And I started thinking back to my time in the 90s at CSIS, and I was like, what if there's an angle here for tech-focused economic development? And what would it look like to be a practitioner of that work? And how could I get a job doing that work in Portland? A lot of things had to happen and fall into place. And kind of fast forward, I did get an opportunity to interview with then Commissioner Sam Adams right before he got elected, or as he got elected mayor. And he was building out the team. We hit it off, and he's like, hey, you've got a really interesting background. I think you could contribute to the economic development team. And so I joined his team as an advisor. And during that time, got to work on helping to launch the Portland Seed Fund and the city's strategies as it relates to technology from an economic development standpoint. Also did some community economic development work with Main Street programs. And then also what was fun was I also had responsibility for some Gov 2.0 and open data initiatives working with the Bureau of Technology Services. So I then got approached by a bunch of folks in the tech sector who were like, hey, we love the work you're doing. Would you ever consider a nonprofit opportunity? And that was the Software Association of Oregon. So I was eventually convinced that that made sense professionally, joined, and 6 months after joining what was supposed to be a turnaround project for the Software Association of Oregon, we effectively launched something new called the Technology Association of Oregon. And that was 12 years ago. And still there. So that's the long, kind of convoluted story, but the theme around understanding systems and then applying them for maximum impact. TAO is kind of an amalgamation of that, where I can work with entrepreneurs who are using technology, which is a tool that can create massive impact at scale, and to help them be successful, right? To create wealth for themselves, their families, their communities, and also provide tons of employment opportunities for folks. So it's pretty exciting work and rewarding at that too.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the TAO, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's one of the largest associations in our state. And the influence between government, private business, launching new business, I mean, you touch it all. I mean, lobby to, so share a little bit more about the TAO.
Sure. Yeah, in one sense, we're a regional tech trade association. So we work with companies large and small, helping them get access to resources. And our work really fits into 3 buckets. So one of them is professional development, networking, events, building community across different functional roles and teams. And then another thing that we do is we focus on policy and sort of government relations, as well as some traditional lobbying work. And then the final area is we serve as kind of an incubator, if you will, for collective action problems or opportunities across many companies. And so they look to us to help to identify resources and bring them in as necessary, and where there are gaps to create new resources. And so it's pretty fun because in doing that effectively, we have to have an understanding of who's here, what their pain points are, and what opportunities look like.
Well, so now I'm dying to ask, because I think across the country, not just in Portland or Oregon, but the tech community has been really suffering. What's your thoughts of what happened and what's the next step look like for that?
I would say it's kind of a mixed bag. One of the issues is the last 10 years or so, there was an era of relatively cheap money. And that enabled certain business models that could take advantage of that fact. And by that, I mean, there was a lot of venture money and other capital flowing to startups who were effectively just adding users, right? They were in growth mode and they weren't really focused on profitability. And so you could argue that they were building platforms that were conducive to acquiring a lot of users, but there was no real business there. And so the idea was you flip that company to some other company that has the resources and hopefully the idea that would allow for how to commercialize that at some point. And the goal of the venture capitalist and the early entrepreneur was really not to build a business. It was just to sell it at some point for as much money as possible. And that model has definitely changed now that interest rates have gone up and the money is no longer cheap. And you could look at pre-2011 or so, and that era looks a lot more like where we are now. So it's not that necessarily things have gone into an entirely new direction. I think there's been a bit of a reset around a focus on business fundamentals for companies. That's been painful for startups that were getting going under the premise that we just need to raise a bunch of money and then we can figure out product market fit. And then maybe someday we can figure out a path to profitability or just sell the company to someone who wants to. That model no longer works. Now you have to be able to figure out early on, how are we generating customer traction to be able to demonstrate that and that there's stickiness. And it's all the basic fundamentals of how to grow a business. And so On top of that, a lot of the venture capitalists have moved kind of up market and or downstream, I guess, and they're not really investing as much in some of the early stage companies. Thankfully, we've had some new opportunities locally with funds and other investors stepping in to fill that gap over the years. And so that's good for this region. But a lot more can be done, I think, to look for different sources of capital for early stage companies here. And then I'll say, too, large companies, especially in tech and more established companies in tech, had, I think, a bit of a hiring spree in 2020 and 21. During the early part of the pandemic, a lot of stuff shifted to digital services and goods. And companies were like, wow, this is amazing. And you had cheap money fueling hypergrowth. So companies overhired. And I think what happened was, now that you had the shift happening with interest rates raising and companies getting pressure from their boards and investors to say, okay, you need to get leaner and meaner and more profitable, they look to cut, unfortunately. And so from 2018 or 19 to today, if you look at overall tech employment growth, it's generally up. But the problem is you had this massive spike in 2020 and 21, and that has largely been eliminated. And so that's what we're seeing in terms of a lot of the reductions in force and layoffs right now. So again, I would characterize both the financing system or the financing environment, as well as the employment environment, is very much kind of reset back to maybe earlier years, rather than an entirely new environment in many respects. So what's tough is people who got started, post 2011 or 12, they don't know anything else than the last 10 years.
And it's like any industry. But I think in Oregon in particular, because the tech community has a loud voice, and we watch it and we look at it. So it's interesting to think it's a normal business cycle that everybody's feeling, not just tech.
Exactly.
And so the podcast, is on leadership. And again, hearing your background, and I love that it's not a straight line. Nobody's career is a straight line. You take these these changes. What have been some of the big learnings, and whether it's a mentor or something that made you shift?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of examples along the way, but one that was particularly impactful was when I was working for a judge after law school as her clerk. She gave me the advice, as did her husband, that you should take risks, and that your professional journey is rarely linear anymore. And I thought that was a pretty kind of poignant observation. Her husband, who was a really successful law school dean and scholar, that was his second career. He started out first in law, where he joined first a big firm, and he went to New York. And next thing you know, he's general counsel of like a Fortune 500 company. Next thing you know, he's also an executive at the Fortune 500 company with certain business responsibilities, not just legal. And in his mid-40s or so, he went to a law school reunion, and everyone was talking about like what definition of success they had achieved, et cetera. And he's like, is this really it? And he did a 180, walked away from his corporate career, and decided he wanted to teach corporate law and spend time with students and in scholarship. And so he ended up going from like a pinnacle down to the lowest rungs of trying to get a job as an assistant professor or whatever, or adjunct at any school that would take him. And he eventually worked his way up and became dean of a law school and a pretty prominent scholar in corporate law globally. And he said, look, a lot of people say you need to go to the biggest pond possible and try to become the biggest fish. He's like, I think life is much more rewarding when you can kind of chart your own path, and it doesn't have to be the biggest pond. And maybe your idea of the biggest fish is different than someone else's. And it sounds simple, but I think it's important to be reminded every once in a while of that. And it was at that time, and talking with the two of them, both the judge as well as her husband, that I was starting to think about, okay, do I make the leap from the Northeast, where I'd grown up, had a really great network and everything else, and move to the West And they encouraged me to do so. They're like, take the risk.
Take the risk. And isn't it funny? Every time I say take the leap, I've leapt.
Yeah.
It's amazing how life kind of was supposed to be the way it is.
Yeah.
And you've been a big risk taker. I mean, again, two startups going from traditional legal path to then economic development. Do you contribute besides, well, I guess let me rephrase that. What advice would you give another person that, may or may not have finished law school, but what advice would you give a young 20-year-old?
Yeah, I would say it's similar to what advice I got when I was at an event in law school where we had essentially 3 distinguished alumni as panelists. And the first 2 were like, I had everything planned out and, it was one step after the other. And because of my intellect, I was able to see this opportunity, which was, again, in this linear path. And the third panelist, who's arguably more successful than the other 2, said, that's all BS. And essentially, like, there is no like predictable linear path anymore. And if anything, it's moving in the other direction. And so he encouraged folks to essentially look at, one, what their values are and their definition of success, and it's going to make them feel fulfilled in their work, and to not necessarily be kind of beholden to other people's definitions or ideas. So part of it is you have to spend a sufficient amount of time in self-reflection. And then the other part of it was being open to opportunities and always maintaining a network in the background, because you never know when your network will either present an opportunity or when you might need to rely on that network to help you out at some point. And I see this a ton in my work now, where we often will have someone who's in the tech sector that'll reach out after they get laid off. And meanwhile, they've completely forgotten about their network for years. It takes a lot harder to build and activate a network from scratch than it does if it's at least somewhat maintained in the background. And you can say, all right, yeah, I'm laid off. All right, I'm going to tap my network. I'm going to start talking to folks about what are they seeing? Where are they seeing opportunities? Hey, can you introduce me to this company? I want to learn more about it. And, rightly or wrongly, there's still a lot of emphasis around referral networks. And that's one thing that I find particularly rewarding about our work at TAO is that whether an entrepreneur or someone looking to break into a tech career, if we can help accelerate the speed at which they can get connected to a resource or to a person who can help them out and break into a network that they otherwise might not have been able to break into, that's pretty rewarding. And I've seen that play out again and again. And so that's kind of a not really well articulated kind of role that we play as an association, is kind of an accelerant in helping folks get to where they're trying to go.
Oh, and you're speaking my language. I mean, it's all about the connections. And it's funny, I tell my semi-adult children still in high school and one down, it is the network.
Yep.
It's not what do you know, it's who do you know still in this world today. And with social media, it gets very blended. That you may have a great relationship with somebody on a social media platform, but that's not the same thing as a business, network. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's a learning. 12 years, TAO. You guys have grown and shrunk, grown many, many times. And it really is about the leadership and what values you bring personally and are able to operationalize them. Talk to us about some of those real key values on building your team.
Yeah, one thing we went through as an organization was an exercise. It's probably, half a dozen or so years ago, where we started to look at, what are our values? Let's break them down. In part, they're a reflection of the team at the time. In part, they're a reflection of leadership, and in large part, it's a reflection of actions, past actions. What are the things we're looking to do and take in the future? And so we ended up aligning around 3 or 4. One of them is personal accountability. So you're going to do what you say you're going to do, right? And that's a big part of what allows the TAO brand to have such force and sort of a good reputation, is that people look to us to be able to deliver. And that also means, though, that with kind of having effective, honest communication is important as kind of a second value of that, because at times when someone asks you for help or, an opportunity to connect to a resource, you might say, okay, I don't have the ability to do that. Either I have too much other stuff on my plate right now, but, let's talk again in 3 weeks, or talk to me again in 2 months, or I can't help you with this, but this other person can. And so being direct and saying, I'm not the right person is okay. And then how do you kind of redirect and add some value to that person so you don't represent a brick wall? And that's also important for external relations. And then internally, that honest communication is so important with the team, because if you're not able to share, hey, I don't really know what our path forward looks like here, you won't get help from other folks on the team. Or if you're not able to say like, hey, I don't really appreciate the way that you're doing this, something could fester for a while. And so those two are very important and are kind of foundational. And then obviously passion for community, right? So, being able to have a stake in the success of the tech sector and kind of what that means, and also in the people behind it, that's an important kind of attribute. And so that's an important part of our value system at TAO as well.
Well, you talk about community, and we all lived through COVID, where all that social, kind of came to a screeching halt.
Totally.
What learnings that you've drawn out of COVID that you're taking now and operationalizing it today?
Yeah, I would say one was this was something, again, simple, but like, wow, okay, that's really powerful. In 2020, we shifted to a lot of digital programming relatively quickly, especially relative to other associations locally. By early April, we had a couple folks get certified in online event delivery, and we had shifted our entire spring schedule to all digital programming, just within a week and a half.
Wow. So
we were way ahead. There were other organizations that hadn't quite figured out what they were going to do until like June. And by then we had been scheduling every other week, half-hour kind of tech talks where I would essentially reach out to someone in our network and even outside of Oregon and invite them in for a conversation on some relevant, timely topic. And because everyone was sitting at home everywhere, it's like, sure, I'll do a half an hour conversation. And we had like CIO from a major paper manufacturer in the Southeast US. And we had her on, and it was funny because I got to ask the question, okay, what's up with the toilet paper supply chain issues? And it was a fascinating answer that she gave, kind of deconstructing for us, like, okay, we were primarily as an industry focused on commercial uses, and like malls and airports and entertainment venues, a lot all shut down. So it's tough to kind of reconfigure a global supply chain overnight to focus on this increased demand in personal, right? In personal and retail consumer. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. And people are like, oh, okay. Yeah, that's great.
I never would have thought of that at all.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah. And we also had folks that were, in charge of like emergency response for the state, and they could also leverage our platform and channels to provide updates to businesses and other folks around like, hey, here's what you need to know. Here's where we are. And what I learned during that time too was a lot of our conversations with members shifted to like 15-minute phone calls and virtual check-ins, rather than traveling all over the place during the day and having fewer touch points. And so with those more frequent touch points and quick conversations with execs, many of the execs said, hey, if I never attend another event this year, but we can do these little check-ins quarterly, that pays for membership. Because I got so much value out of that. And you did all these introductions afterwards to resources. That was hugely valuable. So I was like, okay, there's something there that maybe we lost sight of heading into the pandemic. And so those are things that we've definitely kind of doubled down on coming out of it. So we do a lot more with more frequent kind of virtual, efficient touch points with members throughout the year, especially with a small team. That's important. But we've also recognized the value in what you stated earlier, which is that sort of in-person connection. And so when we're doing events, one thing that we find is people want more interactive group facilitated, less presentations of like one to many, because you can consume content one to many in your own time online.
Yeah.
Right. So it's more about that sort of interactive, kind of genuine connection, and that's animated a lot of our outreach work.
Oh, absolutely. So with your big crystal ball that I'm sure it's polished up, what does the next 5 years, especially tech companies in Oregon, what does that look like?
Yeah, I would say if you'd asked me that 2 years ago, I was a little more pessimistic, especially given kind of the state of the public sector in Oregon. It's not a surprise to most that we do have a reputation of not being the most business-friendly state.
In fact, incredibly not business. Yes.
Right. And there were a bunch of issues that had started to chip away at our kind of vaunted livability, which was a competitive advantage. I think we can get back there, and we are getting back there in terms of improving that livability standard, especially in the greater Portland area, but up and down the I-5 corridor. And if you look at some other areas of the state, like Central Oregon has been booming. You've got Eugene and Corvallis that have some incredible work going on with the universities there, with U of O, with OSU, where they're attracting a ton of really interesting federal research, philanthropic dollars. And then same thing with OHSU and PSU here. So what I'm seeing is a lot of incredible innovation across higher ed and the private sector. And that started even a couple of years ago in little bits and pieces. And that's something that I think happened in the last 10 years too, where a lot of the growth that was fueled by innovators across multiple sectors was happening outside of the public sector. And so, despite the fact that the public sector was, starting to have issues around kind of the basics that people would point to as like any government should be able to do X, Y, and Z, and we weren't. Now we're at a point where there's a sense of urgency and awareness around what the issues are and an attempt to start to address them on the public sector side. And that's happening in parallel with some incredible innovation happening on the private sector and academic sectors. So I see this period of time as much more like the 2010 to 12 time period. We're seeing a lot of new startup activity in the last couple of years here, and it's more diverse, both in terms of like perspectives and experiences and backgrounds of founders, but also type of company, right? I mean, there's climate tech, there's software, B2B, there's B2C. There are companies doing manufacturing, semiconductor-oriented startups. I mean, it's fascinating. And to me, that's exciting because even in 2010 to 12, yes, we had a lot of startups, but it was a much more homogenous batch. And I think there's real power in the diversity and type of company and the perspectives and experiences of the founders. And what's cool too is we're seeing much more experienced founders get back into the game now than we were back in 2010 to 12. So I'm cautiously optimistic and more glass half full. And those are some of the reasons why. And I think it's really tough to bet against this region.
Oh, absolutely. We are very resilient, aren't we?
Yes.
And that makes me very optimistic. Again, as a business owner celebrating 17 years, seeing that economic and political ups and downs in Oregon.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like last week I was in a meeting focused on climate tech, manufacturing opportunities for the state and clean energy. And you had the governor there and Senator Wyden and Congresswoman Bonamici and Head of Business Oregon, and a bunch of other folks. And there was a across-the-board recognition of folks in the room that, our tax policy needs to be fixed in Oregon. It is not helping us compete with other regions when it comes to attracting and retaining businesses and people. And on top of that, it's not really conducive to effective planning at the state level from a revenue standpoint, because we're so overly reliant on income tax. It's really volatile. So it doesn't help anyone on any side of the equation at this point. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? And I think that's what we're looking at in the next few years is what are some of the steps we can take as a state where we don't have to be Texas or Florida in terms of trying to attract and retain businesses in the way that they're doing it. we just have to be more successful and more competitive than Washington and California. And what I've said to people for many years is that's not a high bar. So we should be able to do it, right? I mean, there are some ways that we can, introduce some fixes to whether it's capital gains or sort of our tax policy to help mitigate some of the impacts to entrepreneurs and individuals and businesses. And I think we can do it in a way that's thoughtful, where we win as a state.
Absolutely. And it starts with the leadership, whether, again, you're representing multiple tech organizations in our state to leadership within your own organization. So looking back these last 12 years, what are some of the key learnings as a leader you can share?
Yeah, I would say humility is huge. And I think that's something that anyone who's been around for some period of time will tell you is kind of in some cases, a learned trait.
I've always said it was my oldest child that taught me humility.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
The world did not revolve around me.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, anyone who's had kids, you realize, wow, I've been living my life for, other people. And that's quite a change. But yeah, no one has all the answers. And I think too, we're in an environment globally right now that has entered into a new era, right? So the last 75 years were defined by a certain geopolitical world order, macroeconomic, economic, and even cultural in some cases. And now there's this whole upending of what we knew to be true into something that's brand new. That's exciting, in effect, if you feel like you've got a sense of control and agency over that. It's scary as hell if you feel like things are spinning out of control and you don't have any way to influence or shape it. And so there are some aspects of that relate to how you perceive it. And there are some things that are, issues we're going to have to address as a global society if we want to see the next 75 years be better than the last, right? So I think on the one hand, for innovators, entrepreneurs across all sectors, this is a pretty exciting time. There's a lot at stake as well. And I think we have to recognize that, the fact that we're going through a lot of change isn't necessarily terribly exciting to everyone involved, and to be sensitive to that in both how that change occurs and also the policies that can be enacted to make sure that folks aren't falling by the wayside.
Yeah, and some of these you kind of talked about, which was climate, diversity, AI. I'm going to throw in there because I've always said AI is not going to replace me as a recruiter. It's recruiters that know AI are going to replace other recruiters.
Right.
It's a tool. It's not a solution.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and I think there will be some displacement in terms of certain types of jobs, like where there's a lot of repetitive kind of rote tasks or activities. And so the question is, how do we, again, as a society, provide more opportunities and tools for folks to be able to kind of reskill, upskill into areas that are growing? And I think it's going to be something that requires a reimagining of how we've approached higher ed as a whole. And there's going to be a number of different roles for, four-year degree institutions and institutions that do PhDs and masters. And there's going to be roles for community colleges. And then also for different programs like micro-credentialing, the idea of quick, bite-sized certifications that can be delivered quickly and effectively and stacked, as someone's trying to increase their earning potential and skill set. And what's exciting about tech is that there are definitely areas like cybersecurity and certain data roles and information technology areas where you can essentially start to acquire credentials pretty early on, straight out of high school, and start to stack those and quickly accelerate into higher wage opportunities. And I also think that what's interesting is it's going to really force our public sector systems to figure out what role they play in all of this and how much they can effectively change under what time frame to kind of meet the challenge head on.
Yeah, and it's interesting hearing the macro and the micro, but it's the connectivity that everything is connected, and it's not just one sector or one thing doing one thing. It's the whole.
Yep.
Yeah, that's again, it's a good reminder for everyone to have that kind of bigger perspective. So this podcast, as you know, Skip, is called Hiring for Good. What does hiring for good mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good one. I would say it means a few different things. I think that if we look at what we just talked about, which was, the sort of role of different institutions relative to workers, employees, it's undefined right now which institution is responsible for the reskilling and upskilling of employees, with the rise of AI and other types of new disruptive technologies. And I think that it's going to take probably a messy period of time where a combination of the public sector, private sector companies, academic and educational sectors are going to need to kind of all share the burden of what that is. And I think figuring out what each of those respective sectors can do well and what they can't, and then figuring out how it all works together is something that is both challenging but also exciting. And I think for states and communities that are relatively small and connected, to your point, across these sectors, the ones who can kind of bring it all together in a way quickly and efficiently, and provide those resources in an accessible way are the ones that are going to win and be successful. And for that reason, I think Oregon has a fighting chance. We're a relatively small state. We're pretty collaborative. And I think it's possible to experiment and innovate here in ways that a very large, high population state might find challenging.
Well, that's very encouraging, and that is awesome. So, at this point, I just want to say thank you, Skip. Again, Skip Newberry, CEO of TAO, Technology Association of Oregon. And what a valuable conversation. Again, it raises a lot of questions. So I'm going to have you back on in a couple of years to say, okay, how did this play out? Because we are in flux, and it is exciting.
It is exciting. Yep. And I think you have to kind of embrace the unknown and embrace change, as scary as that is.
Absolutely. So perfect. Thank you again, Skip. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today at Hiring for Good. If you were inspired by our conversation, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you want to learn more about our executive search services, check us out at www.hiringforgood.net or our company website, Acumen Executive Search.
Thanks so much, and don't forget to join us next time for another in-depth conversation about transformational leadership. Until then, have fun.